Okay, so you know how sometimes it feels like no matter how much you practice something, it just doesn't really stick?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Uh,
I've definitely been there, especially with like really complicated stuff.
yeah, exactly. And today we're going to dig into that a little bit. We're
Hmm.
talking about whether when you practice actually matters just as much as like how much you practice.
Makes sense.
We're focusing on calculus for this one.
Mm.
I mean, if you're listening to this, I'm guessing you've probably at least dabbled in it at some point.
Right. And probably looking for like a better way to learn it than just, banging your head against the wall until it sinks in.
Exactly. So, we're diving deep into a study called Spaced Retrieval Practice Imposes Desirable Difficulty in Calculus Learning. It was published in the Educational Psychology Review.
Catchy title.
Right. So, we're going to break down what this whole space practice thing is all about, how they tested it out with real students, and what it means for how we learn anything, really.
Sounds good.
The really interesting thing is this idea that putting time between those study sessions, even though it feels harder at first, can actually make a huge difference in the long run.
Yeah, that does seem kind of counterintuitive, right? Like you'd think cramming would be the way to go.
Right. It's like our natural instinct is to just try to stuff it all in at once. But
Right.
the research here suggests that maybe that's not the most effective approach.
Interesting.
Okay, so the study uses these terms massed practice and spaced practice a lot, and I think it's important to get those clear in our heads.
Definitely, especially with something like calculus, where you're building on concepts.
Exactly. So what's the difference?
Well, think about a typical study session, right? You sit down with your textbook or your problem set,
Yeah.
and you just work through a bunch of problems all at once. Maybe they're all about derivatives or integrals or something.
Yeah, like a whole homework assignment.
Exactly.
Ah.
That's kind of like what mass practice is in this context.
Yeah.
The students in this study got 3 similar quiz questions, all on the same concept, all on one quiz.
So they're really getting a concentrated dose of that one concept.
Right, exactly. Now, spaced practice is totally different. It's about spreading those same problems out over time.
Okay, so instead of doing all three problems today, I might do one today, one tomorrow, one next week.
Yeah, something like that. In the study, the space practice students got one question related to a specific concept on each of 3 different quizzes over several weeks.
Got it. So it's more about revisiting the material at different points rather than just one intense session.
Right, and that revisiting part is key.
Okay, so they didn't just come up with this idea, they actually tested it out with real students, right? Who are these students?
So the participants were all engineering undergrads taking a calculus course.
Which makes sense because calculus is pretty crucial for engineers.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's like a foundation for a lot of their later coursework.
Okay, so what did they actually do with these students?
So over the first 7 weeks of the course, the instructors identified 24 key learning objectives, basically the most important things they wanted the students to learn.
Okay, makes sense.
And then for each of those objectives, they created 3 quiz questions that were all variations on the same idea, like slightly different ways of asking about the same concept.
Okay, so they're testing the same knowledge, but in slightly different formats.
Exactly. Then they divided those 24 objectives into 2 groups. For one group, the students got all 3 related questions on a single quiz. That's the massed practice.
Okay, got it.
And for the other group, they got one question on each of 3 recent quizzes spread out over those 7 weeks. That's the spaced practice.
Okay, so they're directly comparing how these two groups perform.
Right. And then at the very end of the semester, they gave everyone a big final test that covered all 24 objectives.
Ah, so that's how they're measuring the long-term learning.
Exactly. They wanted to see which group retained the information better.
Smart. So let's talk about those quizzes first. When they looked at how the students did on those, was there an obvious winner?
Well, it's interesting, actually. At first glance, it seemed like the mass practice group might have had a slight edge overall. Their quiz scores were a little bit higher.
So cramming seemed to work better in the short term.
Kind of. But here's the thing. When they looked at the performance on each individual question, a really interesting pattern emerged.
Oh, okay. What was that?
They found that on the very first spaced question, the students did significantly worse than on the first massed question.
Oh, wow. So initially, seeing those similar problems all together gave the massed group a boost.
Right. It's like they were able to build on that immediate understanding and kind of ride that wave through the rest of the mass quiz.
Makes sense. But what happened as they continued through the quizzes with the spaced practice group? Did they catch up?
Absolutely. By the second space question, the performance gap had already shrunk quite a bit. And by the third space question, there was basically no difference between the 2 groups.
Wow. So they caught up completely?
Pretty much. In fact, the space practice group even performed slightly better on that third question.
That's pretty amazing. So even though they stumbled at first, they ended up just as good, if not better, than the massed practice group.
Exactly. And I think that speaks to the power of that repeated retrieval.
So how did the researchers explain this pattern? What were they thinking was going on?
Well, they suggested that when you do a bunch of similar problems all at once, like in mass practice, you kind of develop this quick but maybe superficial understanding.
So you're just recognizing the patterns and applying the same steps over and over.
Right, exactly. Like you're rehearsing a specific skill, but you're not necessarily building a deep understanding of the underlying concept.
Makes sense. And so with space practice, because you're forced to recall the information multiple times over a longer period, you're actually strengthening those memory connections.
Exactly. You're making your brain work harder to retrieve the information, and that effort leads to better long-term learning.
That's where the desirable difficulty comes in, right? That initial struggle is actually doing us a favor.
Precisely. It's forcing us to engage with the material more deeply, and that leads to more durable learning.
Okay, so we've talked about how they did on the quizzes, but the real test is how this affected their understanding down the line, what happened on that final test at the end of the semester.
This is where the spaced practice really shined. The students performed significantly better on the learning objectives that had been practiced with spacing compared to those that had been practiced with massing.
Oh, wow. So the benefit really carried over.
Absolutely. They found that the average score for the spaced objectives was 0.77 correct, while it was 0.71 for the massed objectives.
That might not seem like a huge difference, but it's actually pretty significant, right?
It is, especially when you consider that other studies in pre-calculus that looked at spacing found increases of like 0.03 and 0.05 on final exams.
So this calculus study found an even bigger boost.
Right. They estimated that it could even be the difference between like a third and a half of a letter grade.
That's a huge deal, especially for a subject like calculus.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And think about it. That's just from changing the timing of practice. They didn't even spend more time studying overall.
It's just about being more strategic with how you use that time.
Exactly. And that's one of the key takeaways here, that spacing can lead to real improvements in learning without requiring more work.
That's awesome, but I'm curious, the study mentions a previous study on calculus homework that actually didn't find much of a difference with spaced practice. Why do you think that might be?
That's a good question. The researchers pointed to a 2020 study by Beagley and Capaldi that looked at space practice in calculus homework, and they didn't find a significant impact on final exam scores.
So why the different results?
Well, one possible explanation is that the spacing in the earlier study wasn't as robust.
Meaning what exactly?
Well, it's possible that the students in that study only had one instance of delayed retrieval, whereas in this study they had two spaced retrieval opportunities on those quizzes.
So the more times you force yourself to retrieve the information, the better.
It seems like the more you space it out, the more you're strengthening those memory pathways.
Makes sense. And it also highlights that the details of how you implement space practice really matter.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just a one-size-fits-all approach. You have to be thoughtful about how you're spacing things out.
So this whole thing really emphasizes the difference between just doing well in the moment versus actually learning something for the long haul, right?
Absolutely. The researchers call this the learning versus performance distinction.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So with mass practice, you often feel like you're doing really well in that moment. You're getting the problems right. You're feeling confident.
Yeah, like you've mastered it.
Exactly. But that's just performance.
Right.
It's how well you're doing in that specific practice session. It doesn't necessarily mean you've truly learned the material.
So it's like short-term success.
Right, exactly. Now with space practice, you might actually struggle a bit more at first because you're constantly having to retrieve the information from your memory.
But that struggle is what leads to deeper learning.
Precisely. It's forcing your brain to work harder to make those connections. And that leads to more lasting knowledge, the kind that you'll still remember weeks or months later.
So it's about prioritizing long-term learning over short-term performance.
Exactly. It's about playing the long game.
So what's actually happening in our brains when we space out our learning? Like, why does this work so well?
Well, the researchers think that spacing out practice, especially when you're learning related concepts, helps you integrate that new knowledge more effectively with what you already know.
Okay, so it's about making connections between different ideas.
Right. And it also gives your brain time to consolidate those new memories, to kind of solidify them.
Makes sense. So it's like giving your brain the space it needs to process and organize all that new information.
Exactly. It's like planting seeds in a garden. If you cram them all together, they're not going to grow as well.
You need to give them room to breathe.
Exactly. And it's the same with learning.
Okay, so to sum it all up, what's the big takeaway here?
The key message is that when you're learning something new and challenging, whether it's calculus or anything else, spacing out your practice is a really powerful way to improve your long-term understanding and retention.
So even though it might feel harder at first, it's worth it in the end.
Absolutely. You might not see that immediate sense of mastery, but that struggle is actually what makes it so effective.
And that brings us back to this concept of desirable difficulty.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that sometimes the things that feel easy or efficient in the moment aren't actually the best for learning.
So I want to leave everyone with this question. How do you typically approach learning new things? Are you more of a crammer or do you naturally space things out?
It's something to think about for sure.
Because intentionally incorporating spaced practice into your routine could make a huge difference in how much you actually learn and retain.
Definitely, it's a simple change, but it could have a big impact.
So challenge yourself to try it out, experiment with different spacing intervals, see what works best for you.
And remember, it's about that long-term understanding, not just short-term performance.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. This has been a fascinating look at the science of spaced practice and how we can use it to become more effective learners.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure diving in with you
Until next time, keep those brains engaged and keep on learning.
and spacing things out.
Exactly.
CI.
See ya later.